The sun beamed down on the parade field of Elm Ridge Military Academy, where cadets in polished boots stood tall, ready for the school's annual Veterans Day ceremony. Parents filled the bleachers, phones in hand, waiting for their sons and daughters to march past in perfect formation. Flags rippled in the breeze, and the air carried that familiar scent of fall leaves and fresh-cut grass. Among the rows of onlookers, barely noticed, sat an old woman in a wheelchair. Her name was Margaret Lane, though few knew it. At 92, Margaret blended into the background. Thin frame, a cream-colored knit shawl draped over her shoulders, and a faded maroon beret pulled low over her snowy white hair. She sat quietly in the corner of the front row, her hands folded over a brown leather purse that looked older than many of the cadets on the field. People assumed she was someone's great-grandmother. A few offered polite smiles before returning their attention to the field. A young woman nearby whispered, "Poor thing. I doubt she even knows where she is." No one spoke to her. No one asked why she was there. Margaret didn't seem to mind. Her gaze remained fixed on the flagpole in the center of the field, the stars and stripes raised proudly beneath a clear blue sky. Her lips moved now and then, as if whispering something only the wind could hear. A group of cadets marched past, and one of them, barely 20, glanced her way, then looked again. His step faltered for the briefest second before he snapped his head forward and continued. He recognized her, but no one else did. Not yet. As the ceremony unfolded and speeches were given praising decorated veterans seated among the dignitaries, Margaret remained untouched. No mention of her name, no handshake, no nod. Just a woman in a wheelchair. Silent. Unremarkable. Forgotten. What no one knew, what they were about to learn, was that this quiet woman had once saved lives under fire, had once crawled through enemy lines with only bandages and grit, had once received honors too few had ever earned. And before the day was over, an entire academy would rise to its feet, not because they were told to, but because they finally understood who she really was. The brass band played confidently as the second-year cadets began their march past the reviewing stand. Their movements were crisp, rehearsed for weeks, with chins up and eyes straight ahead. Instructors stood along the edge, nodding in approval. Parents clapped as their sons and daughters passed in perfect unison. Margaret Lane sat motionless, hands still folded neatly on her lap, her gaze steady on the cadets. Nothing in her expression gave away any emotion, no smile, no frown, just quiet observation. Her presence was still largely unnoticed, until one cadet broke rank. It happened in a blink. Cadet Matthew Reyes, a top student and squad leader, stepped slightly out of line, just enough to catch his commanding officer's attention. But instead of correcting his posture, he did something no one expected. He raised his right hand and saluted Margaret. The band faltered slightly. The officers on the reviewing stand turned. So did the audience. For a second, it seemed like a mistake. A young cadet getting distracted by a sweet old lady in a wheelchair. But then the rest of Reyes's squad followed suit. 6 cadets, mid-march, broke formation and turned toward Margaret, each of them saluting her in perfect sync. Gasps rippled through the crowd. One woman near the front asked, "Who is she?" Even the announcer on the loudspeaker hesitated, stumbling over his script as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Margaret didn't flinch. She slowly raised her trembling hand and returned the salute, eyes glistening but unblinking. The cadets held their posture for a moment longer before returning to formation without missing a beat. Silence. No one clapped. No one cheered. It was as though the entire crowd had forgotten how to breathe. Then a new voice crackled through the loudspeaker, not the announcer, but the Academy's commandant, Colonel Everett Wallace. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "It appears some of our cadets have recognized someone we neglected to honor today. He stepped forward, walking down the steps from the platform and across the field, microphone in hand. He stopped in front of Margaret. "This woman," he said, turning to the crowd, "is Lieutenant Margaret Lane, a decorated World War II combat nurse who parachuted into Normandy in 1944. She was awarded the Bronze Star for saving the lives of over 24 soldiers during the Battle of the Bulge." Murmurs turned to stunned silence. "She has never asked for recognition. She never told us she was coming today. But her courage speaks louder than any parade." Several cadets near the end of the formation, now aware of who she was, broke their bearing as well and turned to salute as they passed. Margaret sat a little straighter, her back not quite as hunched. For the first time in the ceremony, a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. It wasn't pride. It wasn't vanity. It was something deeper. It was the recognition of a truth long buried, finally unearthed. Later that afternoon, long after the final formation had marched off the field, the crowd remained, drawn not by ceremony, but by the presence of a woman whose story they were only just beginning to understand. Inside the Academy's auditorium, hastily rearranged for an impromptu tribute, Margaret Lane sat at the center, surrounded by cadets, staff, and families. A screen lowered above the stage, and photos began to appear. Grainy black and white images of a much younger woman in uniform, smiling faintly as she knelt beside wounded soldiers, standing beside supply trucks, or crouched under makeshift tents. Cadet Matthew Reyes stood at the podium, holding a file in his hand. "We had a history assignment," he began. "We were supposed to write about under-recognized figures in military medicine. Most of us looked up doctors, generals, inventors, but I found someone else." He gestured toward Margaret. Margaret Lane enlisted in the Army Nurse Corps at just 19. She volunteered for airborne deployment and parachuted into Normandy on June 7, 1944, D-Day +1, carrying only a medical bag and a sidearm. She spent the next 18 months in forward operating zones, treating soldiers under fire. A stunned hush fell across the room. She was wounded twice, refused evacuation both times. At the Battle of the Bulge, she reportedly pulled 7 wounded men from a burning half-track while under machine gun fire. For that, she was awarded the Bronze Star with valor. Whispers turned into tears. Some audience members stared at the woman they had overlooked earlier that day, now seeing not a frail figure in a wheelchair, but a warrior in plain sight. Cadet Reyes continued, his voice softening. She returned home quietly. Never married. Never sought recognition. And for the past 60 years, she's lived here in Elmridge, shopping at the same grocery store, sitting on the same church pew, walking past this campus, never once speaking of what she did. Margaret's eyes remained on the screen. A younger version of herself stared back, helmet tilted, medic armband visible, crouched next to a soldier in pain. The room felt suspended in time. The Academy's commandant, Colonel Wallace, stepped forward once more. "This is not just a correction of oversight," he said. "It is a reckoning with how we sometimes forget the cost of peace. Lieutenant Lane didn't need to tell us who she was. We should have asked." He turned to Margaret. "Ma'am, on behalf of this institution and everyone here, I want to thank you. Not just for your service, but for your humility, your courage, and your silence." He removed his hat and bowed his head. One by one, cadets rose from their seats. A few clapped. A few simply stood at attention. The young women among them stared in awe, many for the first time seeing someone like them in the uniform of a hero. Margaret looked up and, in a voice barely above a whisper but clear enough to carry through the hall, said, "I wasn't brave because I wasn't afraid. I was brave because I was needed." A single sentence that rewrote everything they thought they knew about the quiet woman in the wheelchair. The following week, the front gates of Elmridge Military Academy looked a little different. A new bronze plaque had been installed beneath the American flag at the entrance. It read, "In honor of Lieutenant Margaret Lane, Wubby-Woo combat nurse, Silver Star recipient, and unseen hero." At first light that morning, the entire cadet corps stood in formation. This wasn't a scheduled parade or public event, just a solemn moment of remembrance. Cadet Matthew Reyes, now known by every student on campus, stepped forward and raised the flag. As it climbed steadily up the pole, the wind caught it, letting it unfurl above the academy grounds. Margaret Lane was there too, seated in her wheelchair, a dark navy coat draped across her lap. Her maroon beret was perched neatly on her head, and a single silver star gleamed from a newly polished pin on her chest. But this time, she was not alone. 2 cadets stood behind her as her honorary escort. Several more had gathered near her side, listening intently as she shared quiet memories, stories not of medals or battles, but of the people she had met, the lives she had touched, and the ones she never forgot. A local news crew had asked for an interview, but she declined. "I'm not a story," she said softly. "I'm a reminder." The academy went further. That month, they renamed their infirmary and medical training center as the Lane Center for Combat Medicine, and a scholarship for aspiring female medics was established in her honor. For the first time in the school's 130-year history, a woman, not a general or a politician but a nurse, was etched into its legacy. More than that, her story sparked change. Classes began including more real stories of women in war, those who served not only as nurses but as codebreakers, engineers, and spies. Students, especially young women, saw her as proof that history had more to say, if only someone asked the right questions. Cadet Reyes led the effort to create an oral history project, encouraging the entire academy to sit down with local veterans and record their stories before they were lost. "There are heroes everywhere," he told his peers, "and they don't always wear their medals where we can see them." Margaret smiled when she heard that. Though frail, she began attending campus events regularly, often invited to speak, not as a guest of honor, but as a teacher. Her voice remained gentle, her stories sometimes unfinished, but the room always listened. Cadets learned to recognize the way her fingers would trace the edge of her wheelchair's armrest when a memory hit hard. They gave her space. They gave her time. They gave her the respect she had once been denied. And in return, she gave them something no textbook ever could, a living lesson in courage, humility, and grace. 3 months later, on a quiet spring morning, the flag at Elmridge Military Academy flew at half-staff. A black ribbon was tied at the base of the flagpole, and the Lane Center for Combat Medicine stood adorned with white lilies and a framed photograph. A younger Margaret Lane in field uniform, kneeling beside a wounded soldier, her eyes calm and focused. Lieutenant Margaret Lane had passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 93. There was no family to notify, no next of kin. But word traveled fast, and the response was overwhelming. That afternoon, the academy held a special formation, not for a visiting dignitary or a graduation ceremony, but to say goodbye to the woman who had taught them what service truly meant. All 812 cadets stood shoulder to shoulder in full dress uniform. A single wheelchair sat empty at the center of the quad, draped in the American flag. On its seat rested her maroon beret, a bouquet of white roses, and her silver star. The commandant stepped forward. "She never asked to be seen, but now none of us will forget her." Then came the final gesture. At the edge of the quad, a line of female cadets, every one of them who had trained in the Lane Center, stepped forward, saluting one by one as they passed the empty chair. Some left handwritten notes. Others whispered silent thank yous. At the end of the line, Cadet Reyes approached. He paused longer than the rest, then knelt beside the wheelchair and placed a small dog tag around its handle. It read, "We saw you. We remember. we carry you with us. No music played, no speeches followed, just a moment of stillness, just the wind moving gently through the trees.
If this story touched your heart, we'd be honored to have you with us. Each day we share quiet moments that remind us what still matters. You can subscribe below to join us.